Number 8. SS Bechimo. The SS Bechimo was a 230-foot, 1,322-ton cargo steamer built in the Swedish shipyards and owned by the Hudson Bay Company. It was first launched in 1914 with the job of transporting goods along the trade route between Sweden and Germany, but after the end of World War I, as part of Germany's war reparations, it was passed over to the UK in 1921. Its new mission was collecting fur pelts and trading them for tobacco, sugar, tea, and weapons along the Canadian coast during the summer seasons. For the next decade, the SS Bechimo circumnavigated the globe, carrying supplies between Canada and Scotland. Then on October 1, 1931, while on its way to Vancouver, the ship got trapped in Alaska in an early season ice pack. The ship was coming to an end of a trade run and the crew needed to wait a couple of days for the ice to break, so they hiked over the ice to the Alaskan town. As luck would have it, a week later, SS Bechimo got trapped in the ice again, but this time more seriously. The Hudson Bay Company airlifted about 20 of its employees out of Dodge, while despite the harsh weather, 14 skilled sailors and the ship's captain decided to stay and look over the ship for the rest of the winter. However, according to Arctic historian Ken Harper, on November 24th, the temperature rose from -60 to 0, and for 3 days in a row, a blizzard raged, preventing the crew from leaving the shelter they had. When the storm finally stopped and they were able to get out, Bechimo was no longer trapped in the ice. In fact, it wasn't even on the shore. The ship was gone. The crew presumed that their ship sank, but a few days later, an Inuit seal hunter told them that he saw it floating some 45 miles away. The crew tracked the ship down, but it was in such bad repair that the captain unloaded any valuable cargo and decided that Bechimo was no longer seaworthy. The abandoned ship remained in the Arctic waters, sailing alone without a crew for decades. Its life as a ghost ship began, and it was sighted only 12 times in the following 40 years. The SS Bechimo was last seen floating in the Arctic in 1969. For all we know, she still drifts the vast waters across the globe. Eventually, the authorities in Alaska got involved and launched a project to track down the mysterious vessel once and for all. To date, the Bechimo is still missing. Number 7. HMS Resolute. The history of the HMS Resolute actually begins with another ship, the HMS Terror. The name may be familiar to many of you. The Terror joined the HMS Erebus in a mission to find the Northwest Passage in 1845. This body of water was thought to join the Atlantic to the Pacific. Leading the mission was British Sir John Franklin, who reportedly took 3 years' worth of provisions for the crew. He also packed a few warm sweaters. Why? Well, the Northwest Passage ran through the Arctic, so, it's a little chilly. It sounds like a very dangerous journey for the Royal Navy, and it was. The ice was merciless, and tragically both crews died. No polar expedition has matched this grim milestone. Before it was known what happened to HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, another mission was launched to find them. That mission featured no less than 5 vessels commanded by Sir Edward Belcher. One of these ships was the HMS Resolute. The follow-up mission also didn't go well for the British Navy. However, this time Belcher and the crew made it back home. Not before 4 out of the 5 ships fell victim to the ice though, including the Resolute. Belcher's name was tarnished on his return to Great Britain. Meanwhile, the Resolute sat in the ice as a ghost ship, until it was discovered by the Americans. A whaling vessel sighted the Resolute and it took to the States. They set about restoring the craft to its former glory. What did they plan to do with it? Well, they kindly wanted to return the ship to England, where it was graciously received by Queen Victoria. By 1879, the HMS Resolute had finally had its day. But a piece of it stayed in America. Have you ever wondered where that handsome desk in the Oval Office came from? This is a piece of the Resolute, sent in thanks to Rutherford B. Hayes. A piece of British naval history rescued by the Americans is now a famous part of the furniture over at the White House. Number 6. Octavius. This next ghost ship is especially eerie due to what was found on board when discovered in Greenland in the late 18th century. The Octavius had been at sea since 1761 and originally voyaged to the Far East from England as a cargo vessel. Their outbound journey sounds like it went pretty well, with the ship reaching its destination after approximately a year on the water. Trouble was, they then had to come all the way back, and for whatever reason, the captain figured it would be a good idea to travel through the icy North Passage. The ship never made it home, and for years no one knew what happened to it. Fast forward to 1775, and a whaling craft named the Herald spotted the Octavius. Exploring the ship, the whalers were shocked to find the crew. 25 crewmen and their captain froze to death on board. Frozen at his desk was the captain, with rumors stating he died midway through his work, holding a pen in his hand. Most tragic was the sight of his wife and son, who died in the same quarters. Everyone had perished in the icy conditions. Spooked by what they discovered, the crew of the Herald grabbed the ship's logbook and hightailed it out of there. The logbook was frozen solid and parts of it broke away before it could be read. What pages were left was more than enough for them to piece together the crew's probable fate. The last position logged in the book placed Octavius roughly 250 miles off Alaska's northernmost point, and that was from November 11, 1762, 13 years before they found it. It's speculated that Octavius had become trapped in the ice, then at some point the ice cracked and the ship broke free, continuing on its journey successfully through the passage with her frozen crew. Fearing Octavius to be cursed, the Herald left her to drift. The ship was never seen again. Number 5. Ginseng. In 2006, Australia's Coast Guard discovered a 262-foot tanker covered with strange paint marks drifting southwest of Queensland in the Gulf of Carpentaria. When authorities found it, no one was on board and it had a broken tow rope. Nobody knows where it came from or who it belonged to. Any marks that would help identify the vessel had been removed. There were no signs of violence or illegal activity such as poaching or smuggling. It just mysteriously showed up one day. Australian Customs Service dispatched a patrol boat immediately and pictures were taken of the vessel. Storm Bay, an Australian customs ship, arrived during the night and waited until sunrise before launching a tender to board the vessel, which was drifting in uncharted waters. A spokesman for Australian Customs addressed the news media, stating that although they weren't able to obtain documentary evidence of its registration or origin point, materials recovered on board appear to suggest the vessel was called the Ginseng. A large quantity of rice was found on board, leading authorities to believe the vessel was used as a resupply ship for fishing boats in the waters outside the Australian Exclusive Economic Zone. It's believed the tow line snapped and the ship just floated along to the position it was found in. The vessel had been adrift for an exceptionally long time before anyone found it. The engines weren't working and they were incapable of being restarted. It was also reported that the boat was drifting slowly southwards. It had been extensively stripped, suggesting that it may have been on its way to a scrapyard when it broke free from the tow rope. Storm Bay monitored Ginseng for a few days before a decision was made to tow it to the nearest harbor. The ship went to Waipa on Cape York by a salvage tug where oily water which posed an environmental hazard was safely removed. Since no owner of the ship could ever be located, it was towed to deep water and scuttled. The tanker took its secrets to a watery grave. What do you think happened to this mysterious tanker? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 4. Yub Orlova. Keep watching if you dare, for we're about to talk about the Yub Orlova. The mighty vessel got into trouble on the high seas whilst being towed to the Dominican Republic in 2013. The owner was reportedly unable to meet their financial obligations, and so the ship was on its way to be scrapped for parts at a cost of over $1 million. The sea had other plans for the ship though, as water levels rose and the tow rope snapped. The Yub Orlova was left drifting on its lonesome. That doesn't sound very horrific at all, but wait for it. The story gained some traction when it was suggested there might be an army of rats on board. How the rats got there, we don't know. They swam? Were they already on board? Who knows? And we don't want to know. The whole idea makes our skin crawl. We're guessing anyone who chances upon the Yub Orlova might want to tuck their socks into their pants before they start exploring. And watch your back. Those things are supposed to be ravenous. Number 3. High Aim 6. In 2003, the Australian Navy discovered a cargo ship called the High Aim 6 in the waters off the Exclusive Economic Zone, Australia. The 80-foot vessel came from South Taiwan with an Indonesian crew. When authorities went on board, the engine was still chugging and food and supplies were still in place, but the crew was gone. Everyone on board had seemingly vanished. Bearing in mind the vast distances involved, it's incredible that so many people could just disappear. But what happened? After some investigating, a few of the crew members were named and even located. They had made it back to Indonesia, but the captain and engineer of the ship were never found. They didn't survive the voyage. In fact, according to one of the crew members, they were killed. What we're looking at here, folks, is a full-on mutiny. Only trouble is, it hasn't been established what the mutiny was about. Clearly, something had gone very wrong, but it's still a mystery what happened to this day. The High Aim 6 was deemed abandoned and was handed over to the Australian Fisheries Management Authorities for disposal. No one wanted the ship, so the AFMA came to the conclusion that it should be sunk for use as a fish habitat. However, it was ultimately decided that the vessel be scrapped and disposed of. That was it for the High End 6. We are hoping the previous 5 high ends had a happier time of it. Number 2. Manfred Fritz Bajat. The next entry is less of a ghost ship and more of just a ghost. What happens to somebody's body if they pass away at sea? A couple of fishermen discovered the answer in 2016 when they noticed a ghost ship with a broken mast, which was half sunk near the island of Mindanao in the Philippine Sea. Aboard was one Manfred Fritz Bajat. a solitary sailor who was slumped over a table in the nude. His body was very well preserved, like some kind of sea mummy. What happened to Mr. Bajat? An investigation concluded that the 59-year-old passed away from a heart attack. He was there for approximately 7 days before being found. So how did he end up a mummy of sorts? Well, the conditions out there acted to dry him out, with the salt in the air preserving his corpse despite being in the open. Manfred Fritz Bajat was from Germany and spent much of his life sailing. He did this alone, but used to be accompanied by his wife, who sadly died of cancer in 2010. The pair had reportedly been divorced since 2008. Nevertheless, the loss hit him hard. A note written by Manfred revealed his deep heartbreak. It seems the last years of his life were very sad, and now we can only wonder if his spirit haunts the ocean. Number 1. The Teignmouth Electron. The case of Donald Crowhurst is one of the great ocean-going mysteries. In the late 1960s, he set off to take part in a race around the world in his boat, the Teignmouth Electron. However, he went off-grid for a while, and when the boat was eventually found, there was no sign of Crowhurst. Examining the evidence he left behind, it appears he was out of his depth and attempted to fake details of his progress during the race. As for the man himself, did he fall overboard? Did he take his own life rather than face people back home? People speculate about the story to this day. A few movies have been made about Crowhurst and the Teignmouth Electron, one starring Colin Firth. The Electron became a striking example of a ghost ship. But what happened after? Well, it had what looks to be a happier time operating as a pleasure boat in Jamaica. After this, it went elsewhere in the Caribbean as a diving vessel. Unfortunately, it suffered a sad end when it was accidentally dropped from a crane onto the beach at Cayman Brac. The poor boat needed some repairs and wound up totally out of commission. To make matters worse, over time it was also hit by a couple of hurricanes. As reported in the last few years, the wreck has been vandalized and traces of its former identity removed. Nature has claimed Crowhurst's former home, making it a fascinating and eerie piece of history. Number 10. The Cougal Panzer. The Cougal Panzer was one of the most unique technological advances in warfare ever developed by the Germans. Its design came after the First World War, when militaries were trying to figure out how to deal with no man's land. This is the area between two front lines where it's the most dangerous. One of the German solutions was to create a rolling ball tank. They created their very first working prototype in 1917. It was called the Trefferswagen, but it was abandoned and a new concept was designed in 1936 called the tumbleweed tank. The tumbleweed design was the brainchild of a Texan inventor named A.J. Richardson, but his version of the rolling ball tank remained just that, an idea. No tumbleweed was ever actually constructed. The Germans later came up with the Cougal Panzer and went through with building a prototype. Whether any additional models were ever constructed remains unclear, and as of today we only know of this single prototype. It was captured by the Red Army in the 1940s after it was seemingly abandoned on a battlefield somewhere. Theories about how the Red Army was able to get a hold of this unusual vehicle include that it was sent to Japan as part of a technology sharing scheme, or that it was captured at the Kummersdorf proving grounds alongside another infamous vehicle, the Maus. The Russians now have the only surviving ball tank, a one-man vehicle with a 5mm armor designed to literally roll like a bowling ball across the field of battle. Just imagine coming across that on the battlefield. It's basically a tank-style human hamster ball. Number 9. A solar-powered boat. An enterprising Canadian built a solar-powered houseboat with the intention of living off the grid. He later abandoned the vessel and it was discovered 3 years later on a beach in County Mayo in Western Ireland. The solar-powered wooden houseboat had drifted across 2,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean to wind up in Europe. It was a journey that would have made the Vikings proud. The boat was discovered in 2016 by a local Irishman walking along the beach at night. He didn't know what to think of it, as it looked kind of like a wooden caravan or camper that had somehow washed up on the shore. What was especially strange about the vessel was the message written inside on the wall. I, Rick Small, donate this structure to homeless youth, to give them a better life that Newfoundlanders choose not to do. No rent, no mortgage, no hydro. The puzzled locals posted about the find on social media and got many responses, but no one stepped forward with additional information. Nobody claimed the vessel, so a member of the community turned it into a local garden. Nobody figured out where the boat came from for another 3 years. That was when Canadian inventor Rick Small realized his boat was being used as a garden somewhere and came clean. He had invented the boat to take to the Arctic, planning to live on board and enjoy unlimited energy because of the solar panels. But he could never find a good motor. The whole thing proved to be a poor idea, and he abandoned the boat to its fate. Would you live on a functioning solar-powered houseboat? Let us know in the comments down below. Number 8. Soviet Spaceboat. There's a rusting behemoth of a vehicle in Russia that looks like it belongs in the Star Wars universe. It was once a streamlined Soviet passenger boat that used unique hydrofoil technology to lift its hull from the water as it reached high speeds. This would decrease drag and allow it to travel at nearly 100 miles per hour. Some models were even equipped with airplane turbine engines on either side. It was nicknamed the Raketas, or Rocket. These unusual-looking boats were once the heroes of the Russian river waterways. Sadly, these interesting innovations didn't last very long. While the Raketas were still popular, a whole lot of them were made. At least 3,000 of these vessels were built to patrol the waterways in Russia and Ukraine. There were different models, but they were all the same basic vehicle. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, production of hydrofoils faltered. Every last vessel was decommissioned and sent to a ship graveyard somewhere. And ever since, hydrofoils haven't really been that popular. The only places we know of them still being in service are Vietnam, Canada, Thailand, and one in China. The Russian hydrofoil river rockets are abandoned, some left to rust in the forests, and others in places like the Ratmir base. Number 7. The Balt Machine. The Balt Machine was a piece of experimental French technology designed back in 1914. It was supposed to be a type of land ship, kind of like a tank before tanks ever took off. It had a single overhead track and its skeleton was enormous. They were designed as something to overcome trench warfare. The idea was to create an armored vehicle that could move across the country while being protected from enemy fire. It was also supposed to move easily across irregular terrain, straight across barbed wire barriers, and over trenches dug in the earth. The first attempt at an impenetrable machine came in 1915 using designs by Louis Boirault. It was a relative success. The machine had massive tracks inside a metallic frame that could easily get over most difficulties in battle. But it was way too slow and too fragile, and too difficult to maneuver. The machine was abandoned and replaced by modern tanks shortly after. Number 6. The International Space Station. One of the greatest pieces of technology ever developed is about to be abandoned. I'm talking about the International Space Station. NASA recently shared their plan to abandon the space station forever. But they're not just going to leave it in orbit as a giant piece of space garbage. They're actually planning to let it drop out of orbit and crash it into the ocean. The International Space Station launched way back in 2000, 22 years ago. It's a huge piece of equipment, 356 feet from one end to the other. In January of 2031, all scientific endeavors on the station will come to an end, and it will be decommissioned completely. NASA plans on crashing it into the waters of Point Nemo, an uninhabited area in the Pacific Ocean. Point Nemo is where space objects go to die. There are an estimated 250 to 300 spacecraft currently buried underwater here, mostly satellites. The International Space Station will be the greatest human achievement to settle to the bottom of the space graveyard. How do you feel about the International Space Station being abandoned after all these years of service? Let me know your thoughts on this great technological marvel crashing into the ocean, and don't forget to hit subscribe before the end of the video. Number 5. Cosmic Ray Experiment. An instrument designed as part of a cosmic ray experiment was turned off abruptly and abandoned in 2019. It happened because of a disagreement between NASA and a small host of universities, primarily the University of Maryland, who led the experiment. The piece of technology is called the Cosmic Ray Energetics and Mass Apparatus, and it was used to measure high-energy cosmic rays. It was installed on the International Space Station in 2017. But when NASA demanded new management, researchers with Pennsylvania State University, Northern Kentucky University, and Kyungpook National University became upset. They rejected NASA's demands and the piece of equipment was turned off. It cost somewhere around $32.4 million with a budget of $1.2 million a year for operation. It lasted just 2 years studying cosmic rays before being shut off and abandoned because of an argument. As of right now, there are no plans to reactivate it. In fact, there is a high probability that the equipment will ultimately be incinerated if an agreement can't be reached. For now, it's just sitting in space, useless, not collecting any data. Talk about a waste of science and money. Number 4. The Vespa 150 TAP. The Vespa 150 TAP was a bazooka moped used by paratroopers. In the 1950s, this bizarre piece of technology was part of a military strategy best described as scoot and shoot. It was a tiny military scooter used by French paratroopers who wanted a modern version of a pack mule that could be thrown out of a cargo plane deep in enemy territory. Perhaps the weirdest part is that the Vespa really worked. It was small, light, and could be thrown into battle attached to a parachute. It was based on an Italian motor scooter and saw about 600 being produced between 1956 and 1959. It had a more robust frame than your usual Vespa. It had racks for storing gear, it used a single-cylinder 2-stroke motor, and it reached speeds of 40 miles per hour. It also had a war machine equipped for blowing apart bad guys. This was an M20 75mm rifle which fired 22-pound projectiles at 1,000 feet per second. This Vespa was one weird invention that really worked. They were used by the French in Algeria to destroy enemy fortifications, but as warfare progressed, there didn't prove much of a need for parachute Vespas, and the idea was ultimately abandoned. You can now find these unusual mopeds in museums all over the world. Number 3. TA-4K Skyhawk. In 1986, the Royal New Zealand Air Force initiated Project Kahu. It was to improve the capabilities of their A4K fleet of fighter aircrafts. All 22 of their Skyhawk fleet were upgraded except for one that got lost in 1989 before it had the chance. They were given armament upgrades, new vertical stabilizers, and the ability to fire laser-guided bombs. The project was completed in 1991 at a cost of around $140 million. New Zealand managed to turn these old fighter aircrafts into modern death machines like the F-16 Fighting Falcons. However, they saw absolutely no action. The Skyhawks were removed from service in 2001 and put in storage. The government managed to sell 8 of them in 2012 and just kind of scrapped the rest and handed them over to museums in New Zealand and Australia. Imagine spending all of that money to upgrade aircraft just to remove them from service without any effective usage. What do you think of military spending like this? Put it down in the comments below. Number 2. The Hughes H4 Hercules. The Hughes H4 Hercules was a prototype vehicle designed by the Hughes Aircraft Company during World War II. The vehicle was designed to be a strategic airlift flying boat capable of transatlantic flight transport. In other words, it was a seaplane that could fly across the Atlantic Ocean and bring troops from America to the battlefront in Europe. However, this technology wasn't completed in time to help with the war effort. The aircraft only made a single flight in November of 1947. Only one prototype was ever built fully functional, and it only flew that one time. Once the war was over with just one H4 Hercules ever built, the technology was abandoned. And yet to this day, the H4 Hercules is the biggest and most ambitious flying boat ever designed and put together. It had the biggest wingspan of any aircraft that made it skyward until 2019 when the scaled composite Stratolaunch came along. You can find this giant flying boat stationed today at the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum in Oregon. Chances are, it's never going to fly again. Number 1. The Ribaldequin. The Ribaldequin is known under a few different names, such as the Oregon Gun or the Infernal Machine. It was one of the very first attempts at an artillery gun that could shoot rapidly. The shockingly advanced piece of tech first came around in the 14th century. It was made up of many small cannons laid on a flat platform that were designed to be fired one after the other. There was a match connecting the touch hole of each barrel, allowing for instantaneous firing of every last barrel. They were called organ guns because they resembled pipe organs, like the ones often seen in old churches. The first model was used in 1339 and had 12 barrels attached to it. It made its field debut during the 100 Years' War between England and France. Technically, this technology wasn't really abandoned. It's just that the original became outdated as other versions were tested out. The Italians used one with more barrels in the War of the Roses. A heavier version was used in Moldavia in 1475. And there was even one used on a horse-drawn wagon that had 3 sets of guns to decimate infantry and armored cavalry.
Number 9. The Somali Coast. Starting in the 1980s, the Calabria, the Italy-based Raghetta criminal organization, has been involved in the dumping of radioactive waste. In 2005, former member Francesco Fonti accused the crime syndicate of sinking 30 ships filled with toxic waste off the Somali coast for companies that didn't want to pay what it would cost to get rid of the hazardous materials properly. That same year, drums of radioactive waste washed ashore in the northern part of the country following a tsunami. The catastrophic wave damaged the containers, causing them to leak hazardous materials into the environment. People got sick with a variety of alarming symptoms, including strange skin disorders, difficulty breathing, abdominal bleeding, and mouth bleeds, according to the UN Environment Program spokesperson Nick Nuttall. UN officials who were familiar with the situation told the press that the symptoms were consistent with radiation sickness. In addition to the damage done by the Drangheta crime family, many other European companies dumped toxic waste off the northern Somali coast on their own accord during the 80s. The practice increased dramatically after the Somali leader Mohammed Siad Barre was violently ousted in 1991. After the Fukushima disaster in 2011, concerns resurfaced regarding the dumping of waste off Somalia, and more of it was found, indicating that the practice was still going on. Unfortunately, the organizations and companies that dump their radioactive waste off Somalia are taking advantage of the country's largely unregulated waters and its lack of a functioning government. Number 8. Fukushima. In 2011, a powerful earthquake struck near the Japanese coast. A mega tsunami followed. The disaster caused severe damage to the Fukushima Daiichi power plant in Okuma, leading to a nuclear meltdown. Radiation levels skyrocketed to 10 million times higher than was considered normal. Nearly 100,000 people living within an 18-mile radius of the plant were evacuated from their homes on a moment's notice. Only a handful of former residents have been allowed to return to villages on the very outer reaches of the exclusion zone. Over a decade later, cleanup at the power plant is still in its early stages, and radioactivity is still detectable in the water. Meanwhile, nature has reclaimed much of the surrounding area, taking over the yards, parking lots, and homes that people had no choice but to leave behind. In 2016, photographer Tetsuro Takahana visited Fukushima's so-called difficult-to-return-to zones when he captured eerie images of overgrown cars and buildings. In one photo of an athletic field, only the goalposts remain visible as the plant life conceals the remaining evidence of a former human presence. Speaking with Japanese news outlet Asahi Shimbun, Takahana said that it was as if time had stopped, and yet the grass and trees continue to grow. Number 7. Runit Island. Runit Island is part of Enewetak Atoll in the Marshall Islands, located halfway between Australia and Hawaii in the South Pacific. Between 1948 and 1958, the US performed dozens of nuclear tests at Enewetak Atoll. During a cleanup effort in the 1970s, workers built a concrete dome on Runit Island to house the radioactive waste left behind from the tests. Nicknamed the Tomb, the structure was intended as a temporary fix until the American government devised a long-term decontamination plan. But that plan was never put into action. Today, the concrete is crumbling as radioactive waste seeps into the soil below the building. A major weather event like a typhoon or storm surge is all it would take to rip the dome out of the ground and disperse its contents into the ocean. The damage is still being done anyway, as contamination continues to leak, causing locals to fear for their health. During the 1980s, the US returned Enewetak Atoll to the Marshallese government. The American government claims that it's fulfilled its obligations to the country, but Marshallese authorities argue that they lack the resources to clean up the mess that the US left behind. Runit Island was quarantined decades ago and remains off limits today. But this doesn't necessarily protect residents from the harmful effects of the waste. Number 6. Lake Karach. Lake Karach was located in the southern Ural Mountains of eastern Russia. Starting in 1951, the Soviet Union used it as a dumping ground for nuclear waste for a nearby nuclear facility, owned by the Mayak Production Association. The Russian government kept Mayak and the activities at Lake Karach a secret until 1990. Western scientists first gained access to the site 2 years later. They discovered an 11-foot thick layer of radioactive sediment at the bottom of the lake. Even more alarming, the highly toxic water had made its way into nearby freshwater sources. Unbeknownst to the local residents, around 65% of the population had become poisoned years earlier. In another shocking incident disregarding public health entirely, the lake had dried up in 1967. Radioactive dust blew into nearby villages, causing residents to fall ill. Because the clandestine facility and the secret city its operators lived in did not exist on any maps, nobody knew exactly what or whom to blame when locals suddenly became sick. To prevent the problem from worsening, the government filled the lake in with cement. It didn't fix the problem entirely. Certain nearby sites will remain polluted for centuries to come. But the measure seems to have reduced the dangers associated with Lake Karach itself, which at one point was capable of releasing enough radiation to kill a person within 1 hour standing alongside its shoreline. Experts admittedly don't know how dangerous Lake Karach is, because even the most skilled radiologists lack experience with managing such a heavily contaminated site. But they're monitoring it the best they can, and will continue to do so for years to come. Number 5. Goana Institute of Radiotherapy. The Instituto Goana de Radioterapia, Goana Institute of Radiotherapy, was a private radiotherapy institute in Goiânia, Brazil. In 1985, the business relocated to another site, leaving behind a capsule containing 3.3 ounces of radioactive cesium chloride. The institute failed to notify the authorities as required by law. When the abandoned site was partially demolished, the hazardous material was left unsecured. One night in 1987, 2 men trespassed onto the premises and took some of the radiotherapy equipment, thinking that it had some value as scrap metal. They placed the items into a wheelbarrow and took them to one of the thieves' homes, where they began to take the equipment apart. Unbeknownst to the pair, they had taken the canister filled with radioactive cesium chloride. Later that night, both men began to throw up from radiation sickness. They nevertheless continued to dismantle the equipment. The next day, one of the men became dizzy and began having diarrhea. He visited a doctor where his illness was blamed on something he must have eaten, and he was told to go home and rest. Meanwhile, he continued to tamper with the radioactive items and eventually sold them to the owner of a scrapyard. The business owner noticed a blue glow coming from within the canister of cesium chloride. Believing it had supernatural powers, he took it inside his home and showed it to his family and friends, including his 6-year-old daughter, who smeared the glowing powder on her body. He then sold some of the radioactive materials to another scrapyard. In the meantime, the alien robber's hand swelled up, ultimately requiring some of his fingers to be amputated. The mysterious infection spread to his arm, which also had to be cut off. 2 people died from exposure to the cesium chloride, drawing the attention of national authorities, who soon began investigating and scrambled to contain the problem. By then, some 250 people had been exposed. 20 of them showed signs of radiation sickness and required medical treatment. To this day, survivors of the incident receive monetary compensation from the Brazilian government, but it doesn't solve all their problems. In addition to having elevated health risks due to their exposure, they are forced to face radiation-related prejudices in their everyday lives. Number 4. The polygon. The Soviet Union was responsible for a lot of radioactive pollution that persists in many of its former territories today. One of those sites is a 7,150 square mile area of land in Kazakhstan, known as the polygon. From 1949 to 1963, the Soviets performed dozens of above-ground nuclear tests there. They performed underground tests until 1989. Consequently, health authorities estimate that as many as 1.5 million people were exposed to radioactive fallout. In addition to being subjected to acute bursts of radiation, residents were exposed to low doses of it over time. Researchers have kept tabs on people living in and near the polygon, as well as their kids and grandkids, to learn more about the health effects caused by the radiation. Their findings reveal elevated cancer risks and indicate that the effects of radiation on cardiovascular health may be passed down hereditarily. The fallout appears to be spread mostly by high winds, which distribute the hazardous material in different directions from the polygon. Residents have been dealing with its effects for decades now. In addition to cancer and cardiovascular issues, they blame the fallout for a host of health problems. Researchers haven't been able to link those additional problems to the radioactive fallout, but are continuing to investigate the matter in hopes of better understanding the disturbing legacy the tests have left behind. Any future findings could influence ongoing debates whether or not it's a good idea to reduce carbon emissions by expanding nuclear technology. Number 3. Ramsar. Most of the places on today's list are radioactive, all thanks to pollution from human activity. But the Iranian city of Ramsar, located along the Caspian Sea, is different. It contains the highest measured natural background levels of radiation in the world. In certain areas, the doses far exceed the maximum recommended levels for radiation workers. Ramsar's excessive radiation levels are caused by the local geology. The groundwater boasts a higher than average concentration of uranium, making it naturally radioactive. The water makes its way into local hot springs, which locals and tourists alike eagerly bathe in without second thought. Scientists have pondered whether it's a good idea to relocate Ramsar's residents to a place with less radiation. One group of researchers from the University of Rochester and the Rafsanjan School of Medical Sciences in Iran think so. In a study, they pointed out that natural radiation has existed since life began. So in one sense, it's nothing new for humans, animals, and plants to be exposed to it. But the team found a correlation between the abnormally high levels in Ramsar and the rate of cancer among locals, leading to some troubling concerns about whether it's a safe place for people to live. For now though, the city remains inhabited and life continues as usual. The future of Ramsar and whether its people will eventually have to move remains to be seen. Number 2. The Hanford Site. Located along the Columbia River in Washington State's Benton County, the Hanford Site is a decommissioned nuclear production complex owned and operated by the federal U.S. government. It was established in 1943 as part of the infamous Manhattan Project and was home to the world's first-scale plutonium production reactor. Plutonium produced at the site was used in the world's first nuclear bomb, as well as Fat Man, the atomic bomb that was dropped over Nagasaki. The material was also tested at the Trinity Site, where the first nuclear weapon was detonated. The Hanford Site was expanded during the Cold War. It grew to include 9 nuclear reactors and 5 plutonium processing complexes, where the plutonium for most of the US nuclear arsenal's more than 60,000 weapons was produced. While many major nuclear technological advancements were made at the Hanford Site, the outcome wasn't all good. Most of the nuclear reactors were shut down between 1964 and 1971, and the final reactor was finally decommissioned in 1987. The property was highly contaminated, with over 53 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste left behind. Government authorities devised a cleanup plan in 1989, but unfortunately, a lot of troubling damage was already done by then. Official documents have revealed that the activities at the Hanford Site released significant amounts of radioactivity into the surrounding area, including onto the land and into the Columbia River. Additionally, it was found more recently that one of the site's underground tanks was leaking hundreds of gallons of radioactive waste into the ground every year since 2010. The pollution remains a problem today, threatening local fish and wildlife and their habitat. For now, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Damage Assessment, Remediation, and Restoration Program is evaluating the potential effects of the radiation on the groundwater, surface water, sediment, soil, plants, animals, and the environment. The organization is also looking into the possible impacts on public health. This information will help experts determine what the proper next steps are for mitigating future damage, although it's sadly too late to prevent a lot of harm that's already been done. Number 1. Ozersk. Tucked into the forest of Russia's Ural Mountains is a small city surrounded by barbed wire fences, gates, and guards. It's called Ozersk, but for a long time it didn't exist on maps, and its 100,000 residents were wiped clean from the census. Gulag prisoners built Ozersk in the late 1940s as housing for employees of the nearby Mayak nuclear plant. The people who lived there simply vanished from mainstream society. They were contracted to live there for 8 years, and their contact with the outside world was extremely limited the entire time. Life was good in many ways for the residents of Ozersk. They enjoyed much nicer housing, food, education, and healthcare than the people who lived outside the city received. Even today, the material quality of life remains well above average there. But there's a dark side to this reality. Ozersk is one of the world's most contaminated cities, and the government conveniently kept this information hidden from residents for decades while they suffered from health issues and even died from radiation exposure. Mayak dumped nuclear waste into nearby bodies of water, leading to extensive pollution in the area. Residents are free to leave the city, but must choose to stay despite the risks. Outsiders are allowed to visit, with special permission from the Russian secret police, but are kept under strict tabs during their stay. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about the world's most radioactive sites, let us know in the comments below and be sure to subscribe. Bye for now.